Well, he was right. The welfare state has made the masses, quote, less dependent everywhere. That is to say, more dependent everywhere. But I think we have now reached the point where we can, should, and must dare to dismantle, quote, the system which Bismarck invented. For the welfare states of the world are fatally overextended. Now, many argue that the welfare state is about helping the poor, but I suggest that they should ask whether the same politicians who support food stamp payments to make food more affordable for the poor are also the ones who support agricultural price supports that make that same food more expensive. Are they helping the poor when they make their food more expensive, or when they subsidize its purchase? And when the surpluses that are generated by price floors are then sent abroad through U.S. foreign aid, we find the same members of Congress voting for that as well. So keeping prices high, subsidizing the poor to pay for the higher priced food, and then sending the surpluses generated by price supports abroad are best understood as part of a political strategy to maintain the incomes and political support of farmers. If it were just about making food cheaper for the poor, there'd be no need for floor prices for agricultural products. I think this is better understood as a political system of graft, the use of taxpayer money to generate political support, not a system of benevolence toward farmers or the poor or foreigners. Now, we should recall that the welfare state may be justified in public discourse as a safety net. That's a typical thing when you talk about it. Say, we need a safety net. But that's not what our welfare state is. It's not a safety net for those who have fallen through some misfortune. It's an all-encompassing net that traps all of us. Indeed, the cradle-to-grave system, I learned only recently, the man who used that in a public speech was Winston Churchill, not a leftist by usual definition, who promised a cradle-to-grave system. A safety net may be justifiable, but the justifications offered for it should not be stretched beyond all plausibility to encompass the actual welfare state that we see today. Now, I discussed those issues at some length and after the welfare state, and I also offer there evidence for the following claims. First, the welfare state, the actual existing one, not an ideal one that wouldn't do foolish things, but the one we actually have, is substantially responsible for setting in motion the chain of events leading to the financial crisis. The seeds of the current crisis were planted in 1994 when the U.S. administration announced a grandiose plan to raise home ownership rates in the U.S. from 64% to 70% of the population through the National Partnership in Home Ownership, a partnership between the federal government, banks, home builders, financiers, realtors, and others that had some special interest. And the way in which this was going to accomplish it was, quote, making home ownership more affordable, expanding creative financing, remember those words, creative financing, simplifying the home buying process, reducing transaction costs, and so on. So that extension of the welfare state, making it possible for more people to own homes through government policy, sounded so reasonable to so many. Why shouldn't people own their own homes just because they haven't saved for a down payment, don't have good credit, or maybe don't even have jobs? Why not make home ownership more affordable through creative financing? Government agencies, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, government-sponsored enterprises, were directed to convert renters into homeowners by lowering down payment rates, drastically lowering lending standards among banks, increasing the amount of money directed towards less qualified purchasers, securitizing those mortgages, and a host of other measures. And it was bipartisan. It wasn't just the Democrats or just the Republicans. The FHA, under the Bush administration, Federal Housing Administration, offered loan guarantees on mortgages with 0% down payment. As Bush's Secretary of Housing and Urban Development said, quote, offering FHA mortgages with no down payment will unlock the door to homeownership for hundreds of thousands of American families, particularly minorities. And he added, we do not anticipate any costs to taxpayers. Now, the U.S. government deliberately and systematically lowered lending standards, generated a housing bubble, and did so in order to make sure people had access to homes, to be responsible for their welfare. In the book, Johan Norberg explores that issue at much greater depth. Second, The welfare state is primarily responsible for the current debt crisis that is shaking the world, most notably in the European Union. Professor Aristides Hatsis in the book details that in the case of Greece, but it's actually a wider phenomenon. Huge increases in spending in recent years in the US. The looming issue of unfunded liabilities is overwhelmingly due to welfare state expenditures. To be sure, foolish foreign interventionism abroad has cost a couple $2 trillion, and that's a serious matter that has contributed to the problems that we have. But in fact, the bulk of this has been welfare state expenditures domestically. And third, the unfunded liabilities and the resulting fiscal imbalance that Michael Tanner treats of are unsustainable. The welfare state will not last. There's an old truism that things that can't keep going on won't. And our welfare states won't continue. What matters is what comes after. What will we do when the state is not able to make good on the various promises that have been made to populations, on the basis of which those populations made their decisions about the future? We can't just fiddle some dials or tweak a few things or push little buttons on the machinery of policy. Very serious, radical changes and cuts have to be made. What are we going to do? And that is the problem that faces the millennial generation. The job of creating peaceful and orderly transitions from state-induced dependence on the one hand to freedom and independence on the other, from perpetuated poverty to upward mobility, from clientelism to active citizenship, falls to the generation that is reaching adulthood today. Your elders have failed you. It's up to you to express in public the systematic and constructive involvement in public debate and policy formation, your justified anger at the wastefulness, the irresponsibility, and the recklessness of your elders, who thought that kicking the can down the road would make the problems disappear. We're down the road now, and this generation cannot kick the can any further. I think it's the end of the road for the welfare state.